This past May, about 200 people from across the United States and Puerto Rico gathered in Philadelphia for a conference dedicated to migrant rights.
Because guess what? The immigrant rights fight is just pushing us to the edge.
The sentiments they expressed were a familiar part of America's immigration debate, but the people they were talking about were less so.
The queer and trans folks are being impacted in many ways and in different ways than say, straight undocumented immigrants.
Jorge Gutierrez is the executive director of Familia Trans Queer Liberation Movement, or TQLM, a volunteer-led group that advocates for Latinx immigrants who identify as LGBTQ. According to the UCLA School of Law's Williams Institute, there are at least 267,000 undocumented LGBTQ immigrants living in the U.S. Gutierrez says Familia TQLM's goal is to put a national spotlight on their unique circumstances, both in the U.S. and back in their home countries.
They're facing discrimination, racism, transphobia, homophobia in their own communities, in their own families. Then they find themselves being detained for months and months, trying to get asylum, trying to get refuge.
Trans migrants, says Gutierrez, face a specific set of obstacles. Take the story of 28-year-old Victoria Castro, a trans migrant from El Salvador. She says she applied for asylum in 2017 after being the target of violence back home.
Estamos siendo perseguidas, atacadas.
We're being pursued and attacked. That's what motivates trans women to immigrate into this country and to seek whatever safety we can.
Castro used to run workshops on trans health and safety practices in El Salvador. She says one night while doing outreach with sex workers in the country's capital, San Salvador, she was beaten and shot in the shoulder by a group of gang members.
It's not just the blows they gave me and the gunshot, it's the offensive words they used when they were hitting me. The awful language that people use when they attack a trans person. And then to think that you have to go back out onto the streets where it happened, it was so difficult.
Castro went to Salvadoran authorities and identified the men who attacked her.
I wanted justice, which I thought would be possible because I recognized the men that did this to me, but that was not the outcome.
Police detained but eventually released the men with no charges. Castro said they knew she was the one who had complained, so they began to follow her and threaten her with death.
I said to myself, if I stay here in El Salvador, they will kill me. That's when I decided to take the long trip from El Salvador to the U.S.
Castro walked and hitchhiked for 5 months.
I suffered through what most immigrants suffer on the journey to this country in search of the American dream and stability. That is, going hungry, sleeping on the streets, trying to stay safe. You're navigating this huge country of Mexico, and you don't know anyone, no one to help you or support you. It was a terrifying experience.
Castro says she was sexually assaulted twice on her journey. She finally crossed into the U.S. at El Paso, Texas on January 1st, 2017, and shortly after was taken to a detention center.
That was the start of another horrible ordeal, which was going into ICE detention. It's difficult when you show up and your appearance is completely feminine, but your document says you are a man. They brought me into the famous ICE boxes, as they call them, and they were full of men, and they knew that because I was there, that I was trans. They started screaming at me, and I began to panic. But the officer told me, unfortunately, that is where I had to go because they had no other place to put me. But I insisted that I didn't feel safe, so they handcuffed me to a pole outside the ICE box for about 6 hours.
2 weeks passed before she was sent to a special trans unit that Immigration and Customs Enforcement operated at the time in Santa Ana, California. In the meantime, she says she was transferred to 5 other detention centers where she was forced to shower in front of men and strip-searched by male officers.
I was surrounded by men at points and felt constantly under threat. I could barely sleep because I was so worried.
Jorge Gutierrez of Familia says Castro's story is not unique and that the experience of being in detention often re-traumatizes trans migrants already fleeing violence back home.
These are folks that are already being criminalized, are already being targeted just by the way they look, their presentation, their gender identity, their sexual orientation. And so we have folks, that are, in our base and memberships that were detained years ago and are still dealing with the trauma.
So far this year, ICE housed 300 self-identified transgender detainees in its custody among 32 facilities, according to the agency. There is only one detention center with a special unit dedicated to trans migrants, which can hold up to 60 people. In 2015, the U.S. government announced a new set of guidelines intended to improve detention conditions for trans migrants, making it a priority to place them in units that exclusively house trans women or men, and ensuring that trans detainees on hormone therapy receive continued treatment. There's also guidance on the appropriate language that should be used during intake and subsequent interviews. But a 2016 study by Human Rights Watch found there is little oversight to ensure the guidelines are followed. It also showed that more than half of transgender women interviewed were held in men's facilities at some point in their detention. And it listed trans women and men as among those who are often placed in solitary confinement for weeks or months at a time as an alleged form of protection that is often imposed against their wishes.
We have a client right now that's been in solitary confinement for 17 months.
Lynly Egyes is legal director at the Transgender Law Center, the largest trans-led organization doing policy and legal representation work in the U.S. They've partnered with Familia TQLM in holding press conferences and protests regarding the deaths of 2 trans women who died after being detained by ICE within the last year, and others who have attempted suicide while in solitary confinement.
We see this over and over again, whether it's reports of sexual and physical violence, whether it's actual deaths in detention, or whether it's just access to medical care. Trans people cannot be safely housed in detention centers.
In an email to PBS Newshour Weekend, ICE said decisions regarding the locations where individuals will be detained are made on a case-by-case basis, and that it is committed to upholding an immigration detention system that prioritizes the health, safety, and welfare of all those in our care and custody. Still, the TLC wants ICE to end all detention of trans migrants and for the Department of Homeland Security to use a spectrum of alternatives at its disposal in order to ensure individuals make their court dates. The organization also connects queer and trans migrants with pro bono lawyers who understand the nuances of representing them in immigration proceedings, like looking at immigration options outside of asylum, such as visas that exist for immigrant victims of human trafficking.
And that's a really big deal because human trafficking is rampant in the trans community, criminalization is rampant in the trans community, and we need to be addressing these other issues, especially when we're trying to help people get immigration status.
After 3.5 months in detention, Victoria Castro was released and is currently waiting for a decision on her asylum case. In the meantime, she's sharing her story at events coordinated by Familia TQLM. In February, a trans woman was murdered in El Salvador shortly after she was denied asylum in the U.S. and deported back. Castro worries if she is deported, the same might happen to her.
If I'm not approved for asylum, the danger is that I'm sent back to my country and I'm assassinated because they've already tried to assassinate me. The police reports did not help. I know that if I'm sent back, they'll kill me. It could happen to me, and it could happen to others like me who've come here to escape violence. If they send us back to our countries, they're sending us to our deaths.